Hello there guys, Hirosaki here. This story is all about what if Naruto was a trap master part 2. A wiser and more experienced Naruto is forced onto a team he hadn't wanted to join in the first place. However, as they say, those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Please like and subscribe to this channel before we begin, and check the description box for the author of this great storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 6, Wave, Club Pins and Fights. Sasuke had been completely amazed by the sight of the incomplete bridge that would soon connect Wave to the mainland and therefore had a hard time hiding his reaction to that amazement. He succeeded, however, if only just. A good shinobi never showed his emotions, and he was determined to be an even better shinobi than that man had been. Upon first catching sight of the bridge, Sakura had gasped in amazement and quietly complimented Tazuna. That boy, however. Damn it. Why didn't I think of that earlier? That boy grumbled before digging in his pack and pulling out a shirt that was a shade of orange that was almost brown. Sasuke, take that shirt off. That boy said. Why? He asked. Other than the old saying, if you see a fan, go for the eyes? That boy replied. I don't want the enemy to know that there's another prize on the team, which will happen if you drop that pack of yours. You're still small enough to be portable, and almost of breeding age, which means you'll fetch a good price on the black market. Tetsuo-sensei nearly got himself killed last year recovering a girl from one of the lesser clans, and we don't need a problem like that on top of all the problems this mission already has. Seeing that his teammate's logic was sound in this instance, he quickly pulled his shirt off and accepted the orange one that boy had offered even though it wasn't his favorite color. He'd heard the horror stories when he was little, and they'd given him nightmares. Back before the massacre, his elder cousins had delighted in telling him stories of Uchiha being blinded in battle, and of Uchiha children being stolen in the night. Despite the fact that he didn't have a clan to protect him and retrieve him should he be taken anymore, he had not even once considered the possibility of either happening to him while on this mission. That boy who had never had a clan or a bloodline, and had never faced the possibility of such things happening to him, and therefore should be mostly unaware of the risk obviously had, however. As he carefully folded his shirt making sure the Uchiha clan symbol was both on the outside and unfolded, and put it in his pack, that boy held his hand out to Sakura expectantly. What? Sakura finally asked when that boy made an impatient gimme gesture. Fanclub pin. That boy said, as he made the Uchiha clan general call sign, obviously still trying to teach Sakura the language, though why he had made that sign instead of the sign for pin, he didn't know. The girl rather reluctantly pulled something out of one of the hidden pockets on her dress and handed it to that boy, looking very unhappy to be doing so. Where the hell did you get this? This thing is a collector's item. That boy said as he turned the object over in his hands. My grandmother's stuff. Mom let me have it after she died. The girl said in a mumble, looking slightly embarrassed. What is it? He asked. One of the original Uchiha Izuna fanclub pins from back before the founding. You can tell by the craftsmanship that indicates that it comes from the land of iron rather than Konoha, and the odd marking on the back. The ones for the Madara fanclub had a different marking, and the ones for your fanclub are Konoha made, of a cheaper metal, and don't have a marking. I started collecting the damn things after I got a Madara pin from Tetsuo-sensei for my 11th birthday along with a copy of his trap book. I have no idea where he got it though because the people who kept them all these years generally aren't willing to part with them since they're practically family heirlooms at this point. That boy said as he handed it to him. It'll be far less obvious than that giant fan on your back, but still allow you to hold to the tradition of wearing your clan standard into battle. Pin it to your collar. How do you know about that tradition? He asked as he complied, a little dubiously, considering the origins of the pin. You are currently wearing the Uzumaki spiral. Naruto said as he pointed to a design that was of a blood-red shinobi spiral that looked to be set into a target of some sort that was on the right sleeve of the shirt he was wearing. You do realize, Naruto, that by allowing Sasuke to wear your clan symbol, you've adopted him into your clan, don't you? Kakashi called over lazily from the back of the boat. I what? That boy yelled. Momochi Zabuza resisted the urge to shift impatiently. After hours and hours of waiting, his target was very slowly, in his opinion, coming up the road with his escort. He counted 3 genin and a very familiar-looking silver-haired jounin. As he looked over the team that was approaching, he assessed his opponents. He would have to watch out for the pink-haired one, as unusual hair colors were almost always a sign of a Kekii Genkai of some sort. He might have to watch out for the blonde one as well, considering the facial markings that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks, since such tattoos on kids that age were a sign of them belonging to a ninja clan. The black-haired one was of least concern. As he was sizing up his opponents, the blonde-haired one started sniffing the air, and turned slightly in his direction. The boy hadn't been obvious about it, but he'd seen that method of tracking often enough to recognize it. He'd encountered members of a tattooed ninja clan in Konoha, whose behavior matched that of the boy a number of times before, and had barely escaped with his life each time he'd done so. The boy was obviously an Inuzuka, though why he didn't have a dog with him, perhaps it was ill and had to be left at home. As he watched, the blonde Inuzuka's hand moved toward the kunai pouch that had been strapped to his leg. He'd been made. He quickly switched places with Haku's rabbit an instant before the kunai went sailing through the spot he'd previously occupied. The team went to investigate immediately afterward and only found the distraction. Naruto, why did you attack that poor defenseless rabbit? The pink-haired girl asked, sounding horrified. It smells like people. The unfortunately named Inuzuka replied. Knowing that he'd lost the advantage of surprise, he prepared to make his attack. Despite the natures of the man's students, his main opponent would be Sharingan Kakashi, the copy ninja. In a battle such as the upcoming one, the genin would be little more than a distraction. Fortunately for him, the genin would be a distraction to the Hatake as well, a distraction he'd be forced to protect, tipping the balance in his favor. It was time for him to make his entrance. A properly dramatic entrance that was made when his opponents were expecting a stealthy attack from behind, usually threw his opponents off balance, tipping the battle more firmly in his favor. With that in mind, he decided that dramatic entrance number 6 was best for this situation. As soon as the opportunity presented itself, he sent his sword flying across the clearing that the Hatake and his genin team were standing in to bury itself in the trunk of a tree, and leapt onto the extended handle when it had, landing with his back facing the audience. Based on the reaction of the target and the genin, his entry had been flawlessly executed. Now for the show. Tazuna discreetly checked to make sure he hadn't wet himself. He hadn't. Good. He was glad that was over. It had been a very long time since he'd last had the misfortune of witnessing a ninja battle close up. He had forgotten the sheer terror and confusion that was involved as the impossible happened right in front of one's eyes with potentially deadly results. He hadn't really understood what had been going on, and therefore wouldn't be the best witness to ask if one wanted the story of what had happened during the battle between what were obviously two legendary ninjas later. They'd been walking along the road when the Uzumaki, who had been reminding him of his dead cousin the entire trip why had Konoha sent him, had suddenly attacked a rabbit out of the blue, saying that it smelled like people. Considering the fact that he'd been sniffing the air like a dog while they'd been in the boat, he shouldn't have been surprised, much less doubtful that his sense of smell was that acute, but he still had been. Then, suddenly, there was a flying sword which had nearly taken his head off before it buried itself halfway into a tree. The gray-haired guy moved to confront the guy who had jumped on the sword that was now in the tree after that, and the three kids had moved to protect him. The enemy ninja, who was wearing gray button-fly pants and cow print arm and leg warmers and had his face covered in bandages, jumped onto the water and made a bunch of mist after the gray-haired man had pulled up his headband and revealed that he actually had two eyes, though the other one didn't match. Then, things got really weird, scary, and dangerous. Weapons went flying everywhere as the two men repeatedly turned into water, and then the Uzumaki suddenly multiplied and started setting traps everywhere. The black-haired boy joined the fray at this point and got injured somehow. At some other point during the battle, he found himself in the bushes while a copy of himself blew up in the enemy ninja's face. Then, the two men who'd started the fight got into some sort of jutsu contest and started making water dragons that tried to eat each other or something, and sent water flying everywhere. The battle eventually ended when a hunter nin from Kiri showed up, killed the demon guy who'd apparently gone on a homicidal rampage when he was a kid and killed the entire student body of a school and left with the body. Afterward, the gray-haired guy collapsed, and the Uzumaki somehow made two of his clones turn into stretchers on which he placed the gray-haired guy and the black-haired boy. You're going to get yourself killed one day if you keep leaping into danger without any forward planning, Sasuke. The Uzumaki said as two of his clones carried the stretcher towards the road. Sometimes doing so is a good thing since if you don't have any plans, nobody can anticipate them, but most of the time it isn't. You're damn lucky that Sabuza guy had just been messing around with you. You would have been dead otherwise. And, with that, the battle was completely over, and they made their way to his home and the possibility of a home-cooked if somewhat meager meal, and some medical attention for the injured members of their party. Fortunately, Tsunami had picked up some top-notch first aid skills thanks to some of the more daring antics of her first husband who had been an adrenaline junkie, who had gotten himself killed in a water-skiing accident. He'd honestly expected the man to die during one of his base jumps, and had made several bets to that effect which he had lost. He hadn't been very fond of the man, but Tsunami, who had been young and head over heels in love with him, had refused to listen to his advice, and married him anyways. When the man had finally died, he'd left her alone with a newborn Inari, and a mountain of debt that had forced her to move back in with him. Kaiza had been a much better son-in-law, husband and father, even if he couldn't afford his own home and constantly mooched off of him. Sakura was torn between worry for her sensei and worry for Sasuke. Neither of the two had come away from the battle with the missing nin unscathed. Kakashi-sensei was suffering from a very severe bout of chakra exhaustion, and Sasuke had a broken arm and a concussion. As he watched him sleep, Naruto had confided in her that there was a possibility that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't make it through the night. If it hadn't been for Naruto's quick thinking, there was a good chance that Sasuke would be dead right now instead of merely wounded. Despite the fact that Naruto hated Sasuke and normally didn't want anything to do with him, he had risked his life to save him. When she had asked Naruto why, he'd said those who break the rules are trash. Those who abandon their teammates are worse than trash. Sasuke is my teammate, and no matter what I feel about him, I won't leave him behind. She didn't know what to think of that. Naruto hated them, and didn't want to work with them but would risk his life to save them in a heartbeat. Would she be willing to risk her life to save someone she hated? Would she stand up to a much stronger enemy and use herself as a distraction knowing that there was a good chance she'd die so Ino for instance could get away? When she was little, she'd wanted to be a ninja like those guys in the animal masks she'd sometimes seen around the village. She had joined the academy where her motive changed from becoming one of the animal masks people to impressing Ino, who had protected her from a group of bullies, and then later changed to impressing Sasuke. When she graduated, neither of them were impressed. Was this what being a ninja was? Possibly sacrificing yourself for someone you hate so the mission could be completed? Inside the village, she'd been cool, she'd been awesome, she'd been on the fast track to becoming the future Mrs. Uchiha. People had looked up to her. Outside the village, however, she'd been a minor annoyance to the enemy, a bug to be swatted, a bug that would have been swatted if her sensei and her teammates hadn't been there. Seeing that it was possible, she realized that she didn't want to be crushed or swatted. Right now, however, considering the fact that she couldn't even come close to measuring up to Sasuke, who was the second weakest member of the team, there was a distinct possibility of that happening. Naruto felt slightly worried as he watched Kakashi sleep. While there was a very good chance he'd wake up, there was also a slight possibility that instead of evening out, his breathing would slow, and eventually stop. Severe cases of chakra exhaustion like the one Kakashi had were weird like that. While he was currently very, very upset with the man, Kakashi was still on his list of precious people if only just, and he didn't want him to die. Sasuke had already been seen to. Tazuna's daughter Tsunami, who was a very capable woman who apparently knew the correct way to set and splint broken arms, and deal with a concussion, had seen to that earlier. Unlike Kakashi, he had little fear that Sasuke's condition would get worse, unless the Uchiha ran off and did something stupid. All that was left for the team to do now was to rest, guard the house in case Gato had hired someone else, and wait for Kakashi to wake up. Chapter 7, Wave, Musings on Life, the Universe, End. Much to the relief of Naruto, who had spent the night keeping vigil at his bedside, Kakashi awoke the next morning. No matter what he felt about them at any given time, the people of Konoha were his responsibility to protect. The ninja of Konoha that he served alongside were his responsibility to bring home, and the people who truly cared about him were his precious people whom he'd do just about anything for. Having any one of them die on his watch while there was something he could have possibly done to prevent it was unacceptable. He had been very angry with Kakashi for the last several months. The man knew that he already had a sensei, and yet he still took him despite this. After apologizing for the irresponsible manner in which he had taught him Kagebunshin 2 years ago, Kakashi had checked up on him occasionally between missions, and he would say hi to the man every time he saw him around the village, which was most often near the memorial stone which he visited to pay his respects to his mother and the yondaime before heading over to Yamaguchi and Fujiwara's graves to say hi. When Kakashi almost died the night before because he had overexerted himself during the battle with that missing nin from Kiri, he had been feeling scared and regretful over the fact that they would have parted under such bad terms. Kakashi was one of his precious people, and he was one of the few people who hadn't given him that cold look the first time he met him. His being completely pissed off at the man didn't change that fact. Fortunately, Kakashi had pulled through, and his breathing had stopped being shaky, and evened out to a more regular pattern that indicated he was asleep sometime around midnight. He still kept watch afterward just in case, and there had been no other signs of trouble since then, and Kakashi was showing signs of waking up. As Kakashi was opening his uncovered eye, he went to fetch Sasuke and Sakura, who would undoubtedly be happy to see that their sensei had actually woken up, even if Sasuke was currently feeling rather miserable despite the painkillers he'd given him earlier. The danger had passed. Kakashi was aware and moving around, which meant that he would live, though it would take him several days to recover. Soon, the three of them were seated at the man's bedside. As team leader, Kakashi would be the one to give them orders. Shit. Kakashi groaned once he was fully aware of his surroundings. An ominous feeling came over him. That wasn't I did something exceedingly dangerous, and now I'm paying for it, swear. That was the crap. There's a distinct possibility that I royally screwed up. Swear. Not a good sign. Not a good sign at all. What? He asked, almost dreading the answer because, if Kakashi was so concerned over screwing up, something that was so beyond serious that it wasn't even funny had most likely gone wrong. That hunter nin took the body. Kakashi replied. He didn't know what the significance of this obviously significant statement was, and he didn't like not knowing. Not knowing meant that you were left out of the loop, which was a dangerous place to be if you were a ninja. As soon as he got back to Konoha, he would have to force himself to sit still long enough to read up on hunter ninja and their practices. Making sure he could read properly and know how to research any subject he needed to had been one of the best things Tetsuo-sensei had ever done for him. Hunter nin are supposed to dispose of the corpse right there, so foreign ninja can't intercept them and take the body from them in order to learn its secrets. Kakashi continued. Yeah, he was feeling like swearing too. They had let some 2-bit missing nin pull a con on them, and now they were in serious trouble because of it. That Zabuza guy was going to be coming back, and he'd be pissed as hell when he did. Ninja generally didn't like to lose, and especially didn't like being humiliated in front of a bunch of genin, or worse, in front of civilians. Zabuza had done both. Based on the technique the fake Hunter Nin used, and the damage Zabuza took, it will be several days before he is up and about. We've only got about a week to prepare for his next attack. Kakashi continued, summarizing his estimate of the situation. A week. Perfect. Now this was his favorite kind of fight. He would have to be careful with any of the traps he made though, as he didn't want the locals stumbling into them and getting themselves hurt. Perhaps something that would be set to only go off at the command of the setter then. Inari sat in his room staring at the picture of his father Kaiza. Unlike most times, he wasn't crying, he was thinking. Last night, shortly after grandfather had returned with the strangers, he had confronted them. Gato's too strong. If you stand up to him, you're all going to die. He yelled at the kids who were only a few years older than him, and were about to throw their lives away for nothing. If I die, then I die, but at least I go knowing I did my best to help. The blonde boy who was helping his mother fix up the dark-haired boy said. Do you think you're a hero or something? There's no such thing as heroes. He'd yelled at the boy. There weren't any heroes. Heroes only lived in fairy tales, and the idiots who thought they were heroes always got themselves killed, leaving those they left behind to try to pick up the pieces. The blonde boy had looked at him and shook his head sadly. There are heroes. The blonde boy said. In real life, however, the hero doesn't always save everyone, and sometimes the hero's only reward for his actions is to go to the afterlife knowing that he had done his best, and hoping that someone will take up his banner and succeed where he had failed. I myself would rather die trying to save everyone than watch the people around me suffer without doing anything. Had his father really been a hero rather than a fool? Had his father gone to the afterlife with the same hope? Had he let the man who had vowed to raise him despite the fact that they weren't blood down? Grandpa had picked his father's banner up when it fell when he continued construction on the bridge despite all of the threats that had been made against him, and was going to pay the ultimate price because of it. Was it worth it though? Last night he would have said that it most definitely was not, and that the way of the world was that the strong crushed the weak, and that Gato was the strong, and that anyone who went against him pointlessly wasted their lives. Now though, there was a small niggling doubt, a doubt that had been caused by the last thing the blonde boy had said as he was leaving the room. As he'd turned to run back to his room, the blonde boy had said evil only flourishes when good men do nothing. He had been doing nothing for a long time, and had been urging others to do nothing as well. Had he been making Gato strong because of this? Gato hadn't seemed so strong until after Dad had died and everyone was afraid to do anything about it. Sakura sat there thinking as she tended to Kakashi after Naruto had told her to make herself useful. Unlike most of the time when she had all the free time she wanted to fantasize about becoming Mrs. Uchiha, she had great deal to think about. Last night, Naruto, who had gotten fed up with her once more, had asked her why she had even wanted to be a ninja in the first place, and she had answered him honestly, though she didn't know why. Instead of laughing at her naive childishness, he'd whistled and said ANBU? That's one tough goal, you'll probably make it though. You won't catch the Hokage's attention if you keep hanging back and expecting Sasuke to rescue you however. At this point, she wasn't sure she even wanted to become an ANBU, much less if she still wanted to be a ninja. As she was now, she was weak and could easily be killed if there was no one to jump in and do her fighting for her. But Naruto had honestly seemed to believe that she could become one of the village's most elite ninja who were hand-selected by the Hokage to serve him someday if she worked hard at it. He'd even gone so far as to lay out a plan for her to be able to reach her goal. Strange, it wasn't until then that she'd realized that she didn't have any goals in life other than to become Mrs. Uchiha. What came after she attained that goal? Babies? And what else? What would she do to fill her time when Sasuke was out on missions? What would she do if Sasuke died on one? What would there be after Sasuke? Becoming an ANBU in life after Sasuke weren't the only things she had to think about though. She hadn't known if it was stupidity or courage that had made her do so, but she had asked Naruto why he had killed those two genin from IWA. He told her. It hadn't been because they had blocked his promotion, as she'd spent the last several months believing. If she'd seen two of her classmates, or even any two ninjas she'd met, say, the week before, be killed in front of her, would she do what Naruto had done? Would she lose it so completely that she wouldn't even realize that the people responsible for killing her comrades were dead until long after their broken and bleeding bodies had fallen to the ground? She had heard so many times that the life of a ninja was one that was filled with pain and death while she was in the academy, but she truly hadn't begun to realize what that had meant until now. It was too late to turn back, however. She'd signed a 5-year service agreement when she had earned her spot on the team, instead of the 1-year provisional agreement that had been recommended. The only way she could get out now is if they kicked her out, and ninja who got kicked out were held in contempt in Konoha. If she were dismissed, she would have to move and leave everything she knew behind if she didn't want to live as an outcast. Sasuke too was thinking despite the headache from the concussion, but it wasn't about his goals and ambitions. He'd asked Kakashi where he'd gotten his Sharingan eye, and the man had refused to answer. An expression that looked like a cross between guilt and grief crossed what little he could see of the man's face before he'd turned his back to him and dismissed him. Certain that he would know, considering the fact that he seemed to know any number of things he shouldn't, he'd then gone to that boy for the answers Kakashi had refused to give him. That boy had indeed known as he'd suspected he would. "I heard what everyone knows from Tetsuo-sensei," that boy said. Back during the war, Kakashi was on a team with an Uchiha named Obito. Something went seriously wrong during a mission, and Kakashi came back with the eye, a missing teammate, even more issues than he'd left with, and a new habit that had caused Obito time to be renamed Kakashi time. Since the clan had been alive at the time, and would have demanded the man's head on a plate if that had been what happened, he knew that Kakashi hadn't stolen his teammate's eye. The answer to how he'd gotten it then was that Obito had given it to him. Why would Obito have done something like that? Why would he give one of his eyes, knowing that he risked never finding the right path on his journey through the afterlife? Kakashi had not even been blood, he'd just been a teammate. Kakashi struggled to sit up. It was a difficult task, however. He was tired and his muscles refused to cooperate. He needed to get up quickly, though. He needed to start training his students for the coming confrontation as soon as possible, which would be just as soon as he could stand with or without assistance. He knew what he needed to start them on since he wouldn't be able to use his chakra or move around all that much for a while, and frankly he should have started it weeks ago considering the benefits the exercise held for the uninitiated, instead of wasting his time on completely pointless teamwork exercises. Naruto pretty much had this skill mastered already, so he would have to find something else for the boy to do. He did have a bit of spare testing paper on him that he'd won in a bet. Maybe he would start training the boy to harness his chakra affinity, so he could more easily master elemental jutsu. He knew that the boy already had a couple wind jutsu in his arsenal, and they could become even more powerful were he trained. With that plan in mind, he lay back down. While it was a good thing to exert oneself, overdoing it was detrimental to one's well-being. As he lay there, he speculated on what Minato-sensei's son's elemental affinity would be. Would it be wind like his father, as the boy's small arsenal of elemental jutsu indicated, or would it be water like his mother? The boy looked like both parents and took after both parents, though he favored his mother in looks and behavior somewhat, as that odd verbal tick indicated. So it would be interesting to find out which one he favored in that area. Unfortunately, even if Naruto possessed the ability, he had absolutely no idea as to how one would go about teaching the boy how to create the chakra chains that his mother had been able to create, which was a pity since Naruto could have used them to hold their opponent down while he beat him up. Chapter 8, Wave, Tree Climbing and Elemental Affinity. Naruto stared down at the piece of paper that Kakashi had given him dubiously. Kakashi had decided to test his elemental affinity out of the blue that morning. While a ninja could learn elemental jutsu that were outside of their affinity, even without knowing one's affinity, elemental jutsu that were of one's affinity were usually much easier to learn and that much more potent. Truly mastering one's affinity, especially to the point where one could manipulate chakra to transform it into that elemental nature, and possibly even create new jutsu, took years. Usually, a ninja started mastering their affinity when they made Chunin. Tetsuo-sensei had promised to test him the minute he got his vest, and help him master his affinity as soon as he knew what it was. Naruto's problem wasn't with any of that, as he'd been dying with curiosity to learn what his affinity was, and didn't think Tetsuo-sensei would mind too much if he took an early peek. The problem he had at the moment was with the chakra test paper itself. "And tell me again, what happens if my affinity is fire?" he asked, hoping that he'd misheard Kakashi when the man had been explaining the different reactions that the special paper had to different chakra types. "The paper will burn," Kakashi replied. Yeah, that's what he thought he heard. The paper would burn, and it would be in his hand when that happened too. Considering the fact that the predominant affinity in Konoha was fire, and the fact that he didn't know who his father was aside from the fact that he'd been a resident of Konoha. "Don't worry, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, trying to reassure him. It wasn't all that reassuring though. "How many of these things do you have on you?" he asked. "A few, why?" Kakashi replied. "Here, Sasuke," he said as he handed his paper to the boy, who had been looking at it with a jealous gleam in his eye. He'd seen the boy using fire jutsu with relative ease, and, while that could be the result of early training by a fire-aligned family, it was more likely the result of an untested fire affinity. The instant he'd made his offer, the boy snatched the test paper from him almost greedily, and started to channel chakra into it as Kakashi had instructed him to do. Crinkle. Fwoosh. Ow. Sanuva. Stomp. 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 That pretty much had been what he had thought would happen. The double affinity was interesting though. Maybe it was an extra Kekii Genkai, considering the fact that there were Kekii Genkai that allowed people to mix two different elements to create a new advanced element. Double Kekii Genkai had shown up in some families on occasion though. Usually when you tried to mix two Kekii Genkai, all you got was a mess. At least, that's what he'd heard happened. He wondered what fire and lightning would make, other than a more effective way of destroying things, that is. As soon as the first paper was finally disposed of by the Uchiha, Kakashi offered him a second piece of the test paper to replace the one he'd given to Sasuke. He didn't want to take it though. Watching someone else get burned by one of the things had been enough to make him definitely not want to risk it, rather than be somewhat cautious about doing so. "Look, Naruto, it's perfectly safe," Kakashi said, sounding slightly frustrated. "Your mother's affinity was water, and therefore there is virtually no chance of you being a fire affinity, since water is a dominant trait that drowns out fire roughly 999 times out of 1,000 in such pairings, and there is a very good chance that your father wasn't a fire affinity anyways. Why the hell hadn't he said so in the first place? If he just explained that earlier, Sasuke wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of having his fingers burned just now, and he wouldn't have had to go through the trauma of watching it happen. Well, at least Sasuke had gotten something out of the experience." Sighing, he took the paper and channeled chakra into it. It cut itself in two. Wind. Figured, since the few wind jutsu he'd learned had come to him much more easily than the fire jutsu he'd dubbed the arsonist's best friend that he'd picked up, and that one was a rather small flame that wasn't nearly as noticeable as the flashier and higher-ranking fire jutsu that some ninja had a habit of flinging about. Well, now that that's out of the way, I may as well start Sasuke and Sakura on their training before I show you the first exercise of your elemental training," Kakashi said. Sasuke and Sakura perked up at this slightly, as Kakashi turned his focus on them. "Today you will be learning to climb trees," Kakashi said cheerfully. The instant Kakashi made that announcement, he found himself pitying Sasuke. That had been incredibly mean of the man. Most ninja tended to gather their chakra by using either the ram seal, or a one-handed variant of it. Sasuke's left arm was broken, and in an improvised cast, making the ram seal, and just about every other seal for that matter impossible, and he had several burned fingers on the arm that wasn't broken, which would make forming the half-ram painfully difficult. Not only that, but he was suffering from the aftereffects of a concussion as well. Kakashi was clearly enjoying the dumbfounded looks his two students were giving him over the fact that they were finally going to learn the tree climbing exercise. Well, as far as he was concerned, it was about damn time. They said that each sensei had their own teaching style, but waiting 5 months before teaching one of the most basic chakra control exercises bordered on criminal. He himself had started learning it during his first few days under Tetsuo sensei. "You'll be doing it without your hands," Kakashi said cheerfully in reply to Sakura's whine of, "But I already know how to climb trees." Kakashi was definitely enjoying this like the sadistic bastard he was reputed to be. Poor Sasuke. "Naruto here will demonstrate," Kakashi said, putting him on the spot. "Great." Heaving a put-upon sigh, he walked up to the nearest tree and started walking up the trunk, which was bare of branches for about the first 30 feet or so in a spiral pattern. He then selected a branch that was in full view of the others and walked along its underside, stopping about midway. Both Sasuke and Sakura gaped up at him. Sasuke looked jealous of his rather pedestrian ability. Then again, Sasuke always looked either upset or jealous when he did something the other boy hadn't learned yet. To do this, you must concentrate your chakra onto the soles of your feet, Kakashi explained to his students. Too much and you crack the bark of the tree and fly off. Too little, and you won't stick. Use these to mark your progress, Kakashi said as he threw a pair of kunai into the ground in front of Sakura and Sasuke. Sasuke naturally had a great deal of difficulty with the exercise, which was completely understandable considering the condition he was in. Sakura, however, managed it perfectly the first time. Apparently, the girl had near perfect to perfect chakra control. The medical corps would be drooling over her if they found out. The medical corps had suffered a severe drop in enlistment over the last few years because genjutsu had become a fashionable specialty amongst kunoichi, who were much more likely to have the perfect chakra control necessary for medical jutsu than their male counterparts. He knew this because medical corps had been after Suzume ever since she'd made Chunin. "You'd better hide Sakura when we get back to Konoha, Kakashi, or the medical corps will try to steal her," he said half-jokingly after Sakura had made her way up the tree. Considering how desperate they were for qualified new recruits, he wouldn't be surprised if that actually happened. Sakura stared at Naruto from the high branch she was perched in. With an offhand remark, the boy had handed her an out she could take without disgracing herself or her family should she choose to do so. If she trained as a medic, she could work in the hospital, as in off the field and away from battle. Medics were highly prized, and retired medics could go into practice as medical doctors after a certain number of years of service as a medic should they choose to do so. If she became a medic, she would have the career she needed and the training she needed when she left the ninja life forever. Becoming a medic had another potential positive as well. If she decided that she didn't want to completely waste several years of effort she had put into becoming a kunoichi so far, and wanted to achieve the goal that had gotten her to attend the academy in the first place, instead of deciding to leave once her 5 years or however long it took to get her certification as a doctor were up, however, medics would be valued amongst the ANBU as well. Someone would have to make sure the prisoner survived until it was brought in, or patch the team up if things went south. It may as well be her if it was anybody. Either way, training as a medic would be useful for her future whichever path she decided to take. That, and it would be useful when she was married to Sasuke, as she had learned that children sometimes got themselves into the serious sort of trouble where seconds could mean the difference between life and death. Statistics for this were especially high in ninja villages where one had the risk of accidentally stabbing oneself with a poison weapon or setting off an explosive tag accidentally added on top of the usual risks. Should she choose to become a medic on the path towards leading the ninja life rather than on the path towards staying, however, there was a slight hitch to this plan. Either her sensei would have to sign her up for the program if he felt her capable, or she would have to become a chunin in order to sign herself up if her sensei refused for whatever reason. Since there currently wasn't a surplus of genin, and the spring cycle class was evenly divisible by 3 as well, there was a good chance that Kakashi-sensei wouldn't split the team up before they took the chunin exams, as Naruto had informed her that they needed a whole team to compete. Either way, the odds that she would have to take the chunin exams were high, and, if she did, she would have to do her damned hardest to pass, in case Kakashi-sensei refused to sign the forms releasing her from his team. Either path she chose, her life would not start until after the team entered the chunin exams. Until then, she would have to learn all she could of the shinobi arts in order to pass the exams when the time came. Hopefully, she would be strong enough that she wouldn't be squashed as an afterthought by then. Sasuke growled as he tried once more to make his way up the tree. Once again, he didn't make it past a few feet, and most of the distance he'd attained had been more from the momentum he'd built up on the way to the tree. Sakura, who had never done this before, had been able to manage to make her way to the top of her tree perfectly the first time. Kakashi said it was because she had so little chakra that she was able to control it easily, but he wasn't too sure. He would do this, however. He would master this to the point that he was better than that boy who had climbed his tree with the greatest of ease and hung upside down until Kakashi called him over for some special advanced training. As he struggled to climb the tree, he tried to figure out whether that boy had been playing with him, or with Kakashi when he'd handed him that test paper. While it had made for a rather vicious prank as he'd gotten his fingers burned, he now knew his elemental affinity, or affinities rather. It was quite possible that he would not have learned them until much later if that boy who had already been certain of at least one of his affinities hadn't handed him that paper. What was that boy up to? Had that boy been trying to do him a favor? Or was this the start of some twisted new game? Relax, Sasuke. That boy called over to him from near where he stood with Kakashi. It's a whole lot easier when you're not frustrated. You should stop a while, use one of the meditation techniques they taught at the academy, and try again. Stop and meditate? What the hell was that boy playing at? You should use Kage Bunshin on this exercise to get the most out of it. Kakashi said after he'd finished explaining the leaf-cutting exercise and its purpose to his student. But Tetsuo-sensei told me not to. Naruto replied. This reply naturally added to his frustration. Ever since Naruto had become his student, it had been Tetsuo-sensei this, and Tetsuo-sensei that. But Tetsuo-sensei said. Seemed to be the boy's favorite phrase. Not once had he heard a Kakashi-sensei from the boy. He'd heard 100 yes sirs, but no yes Kakashi-sensei. He understood that Naruto was upset at being taken from his former sensei, but he would still like at least a little acknowledgement for his role in the boy's life. Why did Shimura tell you not to? He asked, wondering why the man would handicap Naruto's potential progress in such a manner. Using Kage Bunshin would allow the boy to learn things much faster, especially with the sheer number of shadow clones that the boy could create. What would normally take the boy years to learn could be whittled down to mere weeks or even days depending on the number of Kage Bunshin that were used. Naruto looked embarrassed and slightly guilty for some reason, as if his not being allowed to use Kage Bunshin for training had been his own failing and not his previous teachers. I made them study while I ran off to play once, and Tetsuo-sensei caught me. Naruto replied. As long as you are working alongside the Kage Bunshin, it should be fine. He said, resolving to have words with Shimura for hampering his student's progress due to a youthful error. Naruto gave him a look but reluctantly complied. Reluctant compliance had been all he'd gotten out of the boy since day one. It was rather disheartening. He wouldn't quit trying, however, he'd get through to the boy eventually. He'd made a vow to teach Minato-sensei's son, as Minato-sensei had taught him, and by all of the gods in existence, he would do it, despite the fact that someone had seemed to have gotten there first. Chapter 9, Wave, Meeting and Almost Meeting. While Zabuza was not yet well enough to be up and about, he was well enough that he could be left alone for a few hours without worry, and Haku needed to restock his supply of medicinal herbs. It had been a few days since the fight with the copy ninja and his genin, and the paralysis and chakra exhaustion had nearly worn off. Zabuza would need some more bed rest though before he was fully recovered, but, in his current condition, he would easily be able to defend himself from any of Gato's 2-bit thugs, should they decide to bother him. After checking on his master, Haku dressed himself in his favorite outfit and prepared to head out. He knew about the comments that were made about the fact that he often dressed like a girl even when he did not need to disguise himself as such, and didn't particularly care. He knew he was a boy no matter how he looked or what he wore, and if he wanted to dress like a girl, that was his prerogative. Besides, this outfit was made from a more comfortable material than the ones he usually wore when there was the possibility of going into battle, and while pink wasn't his favorite color, he wasn't averse to wearing it. When he made his way to a clearing that he'd noted contained the plants he would need when he'd passed through it earlier, he found a boy lying on the ground asleep, looking as if he had collapsed from exhaustion where he stood, too tired to seek shelter. His first instinct when he'd come across the boy, who had been dressed in a dark orange shirt that was decorated with the red spiral he'd seen on the Konoha shinobi uniforms on one of the sleeves, and one of the spiral and a target symbols that he'd seen scattered throughout Yuzushigakure's ruins on the other, had been to do whatever it took to protect Zabuza-sama. In this case, protecting Zabuza-sama would be to not allow the boy to get away and alert his companions to Zabuza-sama's likely survival if they weren't aware of the possibility already. Instead of killing the boy like he should have done, however, he yet again proved that he was too soft to truly be a shinobi, and shook him awake. "You shouldn't be sleeping out here, especially in your weakened condition. You could catch your death of cold. It's still March, you know, and a cold snap could come on suddenly," he said to the boy, who had startled awake and scurried backward when he had realized who was shaking him. "I don't care," the boy said. "I have to train. I have to become stronger than him. I believe that you become truly strong when you have someone precious to protect," he said to the boy. He knew this to be the truth because he was at his strongest when he was protecting Zabuza-sama. While training was well and good, and training oneself into the ground on occasion built character, there was a point where it was too much, and it looked like the boy had taken it that far. He'd done so himself enough times to know that training to the point of collapse too often was counterproductive, and left him weak at times when he'd needed to be strong enough to protect Zabuza-sama. The boy gave him a strange look that seemed to be disbelief coupled with something he couldn't quite identify in response to his statement. "Do you have someone precious to you? Someone you'd do anything to protect?" he asked the boy. "Not anymore," the boy said. "They're all gone. That man killed them." That threw him slightly. He'd been living with the impression that people in Konoha had lived easy lives where the worst one of their extremely coddled children had to face was an orphanage where they'd be fed for a long while. The boy in front of him though was like he had been before Zabuza-sama had found him and given him purpose, unhappy and completely alone. "I lost my precious people once," he said quietly, remembering the day when his father had killed his mother, and he had killed his father, and a number of the people in the small village he used to live in self-defense. "Someone found me and gave me a reason to live. Someday, you'll find someone else, and you'll be happy again when you do." The boy gave him a dubious look, as if he didn't believe him, and didn't want to believe him. It was true, however, while he was still sad over the loss of his family, and would always mourn the loss of his parents, he was happy he had Zabuza-sama. Zabuza needed him, and for as long as Zabuza-sama needed him, he would remain by his side serving him in every way he needed him to throughout good times and bad. "Let me look at that arm of yours," he said, holding out his hand for the boy's broken arm, which had been put in a temporary cast, deciding to change the subject to something a bit less deeply personal. While there was little to nothing he could do about the fact that all of the Konoha boy's precious people were gone, there was possibly something he could do about the boy's arm. Aside from knowing a great deal of herb lore, he had a few medical ninjutsu in his repertoire, and one of them was one that sped up the healing of broken bones considerably. The boy who was giving him a highly suspicious glare didn't look like he would cooperate with his request though. "I'm a fully trained medic," he said. That last statement had been slightly fudged, but he knew how to deal with broken bones, and had been forced to do so a couple days ago when he was tending to Zabuza after his battle with the copy ninja. He knew that he was taking a serious risk in doing this, but he couldn't just leave an injured person without trying to help, even if they were on the opposite side of a conflict he was involved in. The boy reluctantly complied, continuing to look at him suspiciously as if he expected him to stab him at any second. The boy clearly knew that he was in no shape to win any fight that would break out between them, however, and had therefore refrained from attacking. He took the offered arm and gently examined it. It had been a clean break, and the bone had been properly set. Under such favorable conditions, there was very easily something he could do for the boy, and after using one of the few medical jutsu he knew, the bone was healed. "You should get back," he said when he was finished. "Your sensei is undoubtedly worried about you." With a grunted thanks, the dark-haired boy left. He had no illusions that the boy wouldn't report him to his teacher. He would have to swiftly vacate the area and pick a different spot in which to gather the herbs he needed as quickly as he could so he could get back to Zabuza-sama as soon as possible. Aside from this and a nearby clearing, there was another clearing near the Uzushi-Ogakure ruins that held the plants he was after as well. The clearing near the ruins seemed to be the safer choice, especially should the boy's teacher go looking for him rather than wait for him and Zabuza to come to them as they would be later on. After vacating the clearing which the Konoha genin had just departed, he made his way to the ruins to gather the herbs he needed. After he was done, he paused at the ruins as he customarily did while on his way back to Zabuza-sama, despite the fact that tarrying in such a manner was inadvisable. It was there that he saw the blonde boy he met in Kiri, and had seen again on the road escorting Zabuza-sama's target. He immediately recognized him because the boy was rather unforgettable with that wild blonde hair, and those whisker marks that looked to have been tattooed onto his cheeks. The boy was carrying a bouquet of wildflowers as he wandered through the ruins for some strange reason. As the boy moved through the ruins, he seemed to be searching for something rather than wandering aimlessly. He hoped that whatever the boy was searching for, it wasn't him, because he wasn't in the mood to fight, and didn't want to be forced to kill the other ninja whom he was certain would recognize him for what he was, if he didn't recognize him for who he was. Some ninja had long memories and some didn't. Eventually, the boy made his way into the overgrown graveyard that was choked with weeds, and after searching Erewhon for a while, he stopped in the section that contained a number of graves belonging to a clan called Uzumaki. "My name is Uzumaki Naruto," the boy who had offered to treat him to dinner said loudly with a bright smile on his face as he fiddled with a pair of chopsticks, impatiently waiting for the old man to finish preparing his ramen. "I'm going to be the Hokage someday." As he watched from the shadows, the blonde boy summoned a number of Kagebunshin, and, after setting the bouquet down on a random headstone, he joined them in cleaning up the cemetery. He was almost tempted to join the boy in his task, but he refrained from doing so. If the Uzumaki child who he couldn't forget was a Konoha ninja didn't recognize him as the girl he'd met in Kiri, he would surely recognize the fact that he was a ninja, and they would be forced to fight. He didn't want to fight the blonde boy since the boy was in obvious good health, was an unknown quantity skill-wise considering how many Kagebunshin he was capable of producing with minimal effort, and would be fully willing to attack him in order to protect his client as the outcome of the battle could potentially be in his favor. He had gotten lucky with the dark-haired boy who had been suffering from a mild case of chakra exhaustion on top of his other injuries earlier, and he knew it. He didn't believe that his luck would hold twice in one day. "I don't know which of you guys are my grandparents, but I'll bring flowers for all of you later," the Uzumaki boy said as he picked the bouquet of flowers back up when he and his clones had finished clearing all of the weeds out of the cemetery. The boy then carried the flowers to the Killed in Action monument that was located near the center of the cemetery, and laid them down before saying a brief prayer for the dead. Every shinobi village had such a monument, though they were never quite the same as, or in the same location as the memorials any other given village. Uzushi-Ogakure's was a slab of black granite which had been polished at one time, which had the symbol of the village, and the names of the dead etched into it. Time had taken the shine off of it and begun to wear the names away, but they were still legible, and a large number of them had been Uzumaki. As he watched the boy pay his respects to his fallen relatives, he felt slightly guilty, as if he were spying on something private. It was then that he realized that he had been trespassing in the home of this boy's ancestors for years without once properly paying his respects to the dead. While the Uzumaki's attention was turned elsewhere, he quietly left the cemetery, hoping the boy wouldn't notice that someone had intruded on his solitude. Naruto got up from where he had been kneeling in front of the Uzushio monument. He had had the feeling that he was being watched the entire time he'd been in the ruins of the former ninja village, but now it was gone. Whether that was because his ancestors had been appeased by his attempts to pay his respects or because someone had actually been watching him and only just left, he didn't know. He had asked Tazuna-san for directions to the village earlier this morning, and the old man had rather reluctantly given them to him. It seemed that people avoided this place, believing it to be haunted. He too had a fear of ghosts, and had been slightly nervous when he had felt someone watching him from the shadows and had been unable to see him or her. If it had been a spirit, they apparently weren't offended by his presence. To get here today, he had taken one of the sorts of breaks from training that would have had Tetsuo-sensei rip him a new one if he'd caught him doing it. He had left his Kagebunshin to do all of the work while he went and did something else. Tetsuo-sensei had told him that leaving his Kagebunshin behind to do all the work was an exceedingly stupid and lazy thing to do when he had caught him doing it, as he would get in the habit of foisting all of his tasks off on his clones and never really learn to do anything for himself because his clones would then become lazier as a result of him becoming lazier, starting a vicious cycle. But today, there had been some extenuating circumstances. He had wanted to pay his respects to the ancestors he had never known in case he didn't get a chance to do so later, and hadn't wanted to stop his training either. After setting his clones to the leaf-cutting task that they seemed to be close to accomplishing, he had set out to gather flowers as an offering as there had not been any to be bought in the small town near Tazuna's house. Once he had the flowers, he came here. The ruins of Uzushio-gakure were a desolate and lonely place, and some of the buildings looked as if they had been scavenged for building materials. Considering the current economic situation and the price of such materials, he understood why the locals had done so and didn't begrudge them what they took, since it would be better for them to be of use to the living than to crumble to dust and be completely forgotten. At least, the people who had gone scavenging for building materials had had the decency to leave the graveyard and the monument alone. The only issue he had with that was that it had been left entirely alone, and it looked as if nobody had come to tend to any of the graves in years if not decades. Deciding that it was the least he could do, he summoned another batch of Kagebunshin, and weeded the place while the one he'd assigned as a scout went to look for the village's Kia memorial. He knew that every village had one, because he'd asked Tetsuo-sensei about it when he'd spotted Kiris before the start of the rather ill-fated Chunin exams. Eventually, the cemetery was cleared, the monument was found, he'd been able to pay his respects, and the strange presence that had been making him nervous had vanished. He didn't get very much time to ponder the reason behind the vanishing of the other presence. Considering the fact that one of the Kagebunshin that had just dispelled had been informed by Kakashi that there had been some sort of incident with Sasuke earlier, he decided that it would be better to shelve that mystery for later and should head back to Tazuna's. Sasuke looked down at his arm once more. Someone who was his enemy, and therefore pretty much had an obligation to kill him, had healed him instead. Why? Why do something like that for a complete stranger that you would be fighting, if not then later? Had he healed him so he would have a better fight when the time came, or had he really done it out of the kindness of his heart as he had appeared to have done? What the boy who had dressed like a girl had said about finding someone who would give him purpose and becoming happy again had bothered him as well. How would he ever be happy again with his entire family gone? Who would he find that would compare to the people he had lost? And if he did find someone who compared, what would happen to that person if that man were still alive and found out about them? That man had told him that in order to get the eyes he needed to be able to come close to equaling him, he would have to kill the one closest to him. That would naturally be any precious person he found or who found him. Would he really kill his precious person after he found him or her in order to avenge his clan? Most disturbing to him was the fact that a part of himself had said yes. It would seem that to protect this precious person, whoever he or she may be, the best thing to do would be to never find them in order to protect them from himself. Chapter 10, Wave, the Battle on the Bridge. Naruto swore. The two bastards from about a week ago had shown up at least a day earlier than expected, and in a place that had been completely unexpected considering the usual modus operandi of the sort of missing nin, who were of a more mercenary bent. Rather than showing up in a place where they could cause a great deal of collateral damage which would have left the team scrabbling to protect innocent bystanders, they had turned up on a newly built section of bridge he hadn't gotten around to trapping yet because he'd run out of certain necessary materials and hadn't found ones he could use to jury-rig traps that would capture a ninja. He was now seriously regretting focusing more on Tazuna's home and the nearby village where he believed an attack more likely due to the fact that the team would be distracted trying to avoid harm befalling innocent bystanders and therefore be more vulnerable. He swore again when he realized that he'd flipping left Tazuna's home almost completely unprotected aside from a few traps he'd shown Tazuna's family to avoid in case he wasn't around to set off the others for some reason, as he deemed automatic traps that didn't require someone there to set them off to be a danger in this case, especially with small children and untrained civilians around. Looking back now, he realized that he should have thought to leave at least one clone behind to activate the traps he had set. As Tetsuo-sensei used to say, bad things happen when people don't think. After he finished swearing, he made a few Kage Bunshin while Sasuke was busy cutting down Zabuza's Mizu Bunshin at Kakashi's urging and dispatched them to Tazuna's residence in case there was someone else waiting in the wings to try something underhanded while he and his team were otherwise occupied. Zabuza had one accomplice with him, and logic dictated that where there was one, there was usually more, and that any of the ones he couldn't see in front of him could be getting up to any amount of mischief. When he turned back to the fight after sending the clones off, the Zabuza guy himself had shown up along with his masked accomplice. The instant after they appeared, Sasuke volunteered to be the one to deal with the accomplice, which meant that he would be hanging back with the rest of the team and protecting the client until it looked like Sasuke needed assistance. Despite the prodigious speed of Zabuza's accomplice, who was so fast that he created his own whirlwind, Sasuke had him evenly matched. This wasn't all that surprising considering that two areas that Sasuke seemed to really shine in were speed and taijutsu, so he was the better choice to face Zabuza's accomplice in a straight-up fight in this case. From the looks of things, Sasuke wouldn't be needing any help despite his opponent's surprising ability to make one-handed seals, which was revealed when Sasuke had restrained the other hand. Based on Sasuke's current speed and the speed of those water, or rather ice Senbon, Sasuke would be able to easily escape the jutsu. His job for now was to protect the client from Zabuza, who had not yet made a single move in their direction since the destruction of his Mizu Bunshin for some strange reason. Inari had been on the toilet when he had heard the loud swearing coming from outside. His first thought when he'd heard it had been that one of the neighbors had stopped by for a visit and had run afoul of one of Naruto's traps. He'd nearly done that himself on more than one occasion, and had almost had to be rescued once. That initial notion had been thrown out the window when he heard his mother scream and several dishes shatter, however. When he ran out of the toilet to see what was happening, he saw two men with swords taking his mother hostage. One of the men had tattoos on his face that reminded him of clown makeup and was wearing a hoodie, and the other one, who wore an eye patch with 3 straps, was topless and covered in tattoos. When they noticed him, the one with the tattoos on his chest and arms moved to attack him. "If you hurt him, I'll kill myself," his mother said, halting the man in his tracks. "You need a hostage, right? And you won't have one if you harm him." The man, who was some sort of robed swordsman, turned away from him and back to his mother, who glared at him defiantly, daring him to make a move. The robed swordsman and his partner then bound his mother and started dragging her away as he stood by and watched helplessly. They had taken his mother, and there had been nothing he could do about it. If Naruto were here, he would. Whatever he would do, it wouldn't be standing here watching as his mother was dragged away like he was doing. That Kakashi man had told him as much a couple days earlier. The boy named Naruto who'd lectured him on his first day here came in 5 minutes after the boy named Sasuke, completely wiped from his training. When he slumped over at the dinner table after the meal had ended, it was obvious that he was completely exhausted, even more so than the Sasuke boy who looked pretty tore up himself. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you do this when it's not even your fight? It's not your country, and it's not your business. Why do you do this even knowing that you're just going to die?" "Because this was once my mother's home. And, even if it wasn't her home, I'd do it anyway because it's the right thing to do," Naruto replied, sounding upset. "I could just as easily ask you why you sit around wailing that you can do nothing while your people suffer without even trying to do something about it." Unable to reply to the boy's accusation since he couldn't think of one that didn't sound like a pathetic excuse even to himself, he ran outside. Even though every reply he could think of sounded like an excuse, he knew that there was nothing that he could do about the way things were. He was just too small, and there was only one of him. As he was sitting on the dock that was attached to the house thinking how unfair the Naruto boy's question had been, Naruto's teacher came outside and joined him. "Naruto's like you in some ways," Kakashi-san said. "He never knew his father while growing up as well." As he furiously scrubbed the tears from his eyes so he wouldn't look like a total sissy in front of this stranger, he wondered why the man was telling him this. He never knew his mother either, since both of his parents died the day he was born. He had no friends as a small child, but he never let that get him down, and I've never once seen him cry about the fact that he was alone, even when there had been no one there for him. I think he got tired of crying early on," Kakashi-san continued. He sat still wondering exactly where this story was going since so far, all he was hearing was that Naruto didn't cry despite the fact that he didn't have any parents. Naruto's life wasn't anything like his, however. No evil man had taken over his home and killed the man he'd called father right in front of him. What few friends he did manage to make became all the more precious to him because they had been few and far between. Kakashi-san continued. What did this have to do with him? So, Naruto had had a bad life but not as bad as his. One day, 2 of his friends were killed, and 3 others were badly injured right in front of him, and he was then left to face 2 much larger and stronger opponents alone since there was nobody around to help. Kakashi-san said. What happened next? He asked, realizing what the man had finally been getting at. Instead of fleeing, Naruto did what he had to do to save his friends, even though there was a very good chance that he could die doing so. At that point, all he cared about was getting his remaining friends to safety, and he did everything it took to do so despite the fact that he was outarmed, outnumbered, and the enemy held the advantage. Kakashi-san replied. Here he was in a similar situation to the one Naruto had been in back then. His mother was being taken away from him, and rather than fighting, he was sitting and crying about not being able to do anything without even once trying. His stepfather Kaiza had told him that if there was something precious to you, you protected it with your own 2 hands, even if it meant risking dying. Right now, the most precious thing in his life was being taken from him, and he wasn't even trying to protect it. Like hell. There was a time when someone had to stop crying and running away, and stand up to fight for what was theirs no matter how strong the people taking it from them were, and that time was now. Let go of my mom. He yelled at the 2 men who were leading his mother away after he'd run from the house and onto the wooden walkway that led to the path to the village to confront them. Run, Inari! His mother yelled as the 2 men whirled to face him. As she yelled for him to flee, one of the men knocked her to the ground. They had hurt his mother. He was going to kill them. He had no weapons, and the men who had his mother had swords, but that didn't matter. Like in that old story, he would hit them, and if they cut off his arms, he would kick them, and if they cut off his legs, he would bite them to death. He wasn't going to let them take his mother away from him. His mother was one of the most precious things in his life, and he would do everything in his power to protect her. The men moved to attack him, and he suddenly found himself elsewhere. Thanks for distracting them, kid, said Naruto, who had shown up out of nowhere, taken him out of the path of danger, and was unbinding his mother whom he had rescued as well. I wasn't sure if I would make it in time. As he stared up at the other boy in wonder, he heard something behind him. When he turned to see what the commotion behind him was, he saw that it was two more Narutos who were beating the crap out of the men who had taken his mother. Seems you really do have a backbone, kid. Naruto, or was it another one of his clones? Said as he patted him on the head. Moments after the fight started, the two men who had taken his mother were down on the ground, bruised, bleeding, and unconscious, brought low by someone who was only half their size. Seeing them in this state, he realized that they were not the insurmountable obstacles he had at first thought them to be. It was as Naruto had said earlier, they were only strong as long as you did nothing. In that case, he would make everyone do something, and they would take the strength away from the biggest of the monsters. He would rally everyone and have them fight. This was their home, and Gato couldn't have it. Where are you going? Naruto asked when he turned back to the house to grab any weapons he could find. I'm going to get everyone, and we'll get Gato together. He replied. Well, in that case, I think I'll help. It's better than just hanging around here looking after you guys. Naruto replied. Besides, I will be needing to tell the villagers what areas to avoid if boss and the others fail at the bridge, and it comes down to a street fight. Naruto watched as Sasuke became trapped in an unknown jutsu that involved sheets of ice. Within the jutsu, the boy with the name that was very familiar for some reason was peppering Sasuke with Senbon. He knew for a fact that the boy was deadly accurate with those things since he had paralyzed his master with them by unerringly throwing them at points that were very close to spots that would have been fatal, which made this activity more puzzling, unless the boy wasn't actively trying to kill Sasuke. Outside of the fight between Sasuke and Zabuza's accomplice, there was a virtual standstill as they stood facing Zabuza, who had yet to make a move. Why were their opponents not actively trying to kill them? He knew that part of the reason that Zabuza hadn't tried to kill them was because Kakashi was keeping Zabuza in check in regards to Tazuna, and Zabuza was keeping Kakashi in check in regards to Sasuke. In that fight, neither would move until one or the other was certain of their advantage, which was the reason why Zabuza currently wasn't trying to turn them into sashimi with that sword. Sasuke's opponent, however, there was no reason for Zabuza's accomplice to spare Sasuke, no reason at all. He had him completely outclassed in that jutsu, and could have ended it all in the first strike. Instead of killing him right away, however, he was giving Sasuke a very slow death with 1,000 paper cuts and every opportunity to figure out a way to defeat his opponent. As he watched the fight, trying to figure out what Zabuza's accomplice was up to, Sakura went over and tossed a kunai to Sasuke, who had dropped his in the boy Haku's initial attack. The kunai didn't reach its intended recipient, however, because Haku went through the other side of one of the mirrors he'd rather foolishly assumed had been one way, and caught the thrown weapon before it could reach Sasuke. This gave him the first bit of good news he'd had throughout the entire battle. If Zabuza's apprentice was forced to fight on both sides of the mirrors, there would be an increased chance of the boy making a mistake that would allow them to defeat him. With that in mind, he made his way over to the unusual jutsu that was a result of a Kekii Genkai in which Sasuke was trapped, hoping that Sakura and Kakashi would be enough to protect Tazuna should Zabuza finally decide that attacking would be to his advantage. When he reached the dome of ice mirrors, he circled it looking for any weaknesses. There were none that he could see. After his first circuit, he decided to check the strength of the mirrors themselves. As he was powering up one of his wind jutsu, Zabuza threw several shuriken at him, which Haku knocked off course with several senbon. Please let me deal with them, Zabuza-sama. The boy named Haku said as the shuriken clattered to the ground. Fine, Haku, go ahead. Zabuza replied before turning back to his standoff with Kakashi. Sasuke took the opportunity to attack since Haku was distracted with him, but it didn't do him much good since the boy hadn't been nearly as distracted as he had seemed, and he intercepted Sasuke's attack and made yet another attack on Sasuke. In this attack, Sasuke was hit by about 1,000 more senbon, and yet again the needles caused minimal damage, slicing here, scraping there, none of them stabbing into the boy who looked a bit like a pincushion. During Haku's attack on Sasuke, he attacked one of the mirrors with the wind jutsu he'd been in the middle of forming when Zabuza had thrown his shuriken, and it did not break. It didn't even so much as crack. The Zabuza's accomplice responded to this attack by sending a volley of Senbon in his direction while tossing yet another one at Sasuke. Undaunted, he attacked the mirror again at the same point that he had attacked it before, hoping to further weaken it. Nothing. He attacked it again. Still nothing. Inside the mirrors, Sasuke used one of his fireball jutsu. The mirror that it hit briefly started to melt by the time the fireball had burnt itself out, and rapidly reformed shortly after it had done so. He attacked the mirror that took the brunt of Sasuke's attack, hoping that the melting and reformation of the mirror had weakened it somehow. Nothing there either. Realizing that he was getting nowhere, he decided to use the strongest of his small arsenal of wind jutsu on the mirrors, despite the fact that he only had it half-mastered and Tetsuo-sensei would have given him hell for using a jutsu he hadn't fully mastered in battle. After making the seals for the Kazakiri no Jutsu, he launched the blade of wind at the mirror closest to him. It barely made a dent. "Why do you try so hard to defend him?" the boy Haku asked. "Is he precious to you?" "No," he replied honestly. "But my mother and the Yondaime entrusted me with the protection of Konoha and its citizens before they died, and they are precious to me. I will not let anyone from Konoha be harmed if there is anything I could do to prevent it. I will not let them down. I too have someone I need to protect," the boy said. "Being a shinobi is difficult for me, and I do not want to kill you, but I will kill my heart and be a shinobi in order to protect my precious person. He has entrusted his dreams to me, and I will not let him down either. I'm sorry." With that, the boy started to attack Sasuke once more. There was nothing he could do about it from out here, but try to break the jutsu since the boy was moving far too fast. Perhaps, he sent a number of Kage Bunshin into the jutsu to assist Sasuke. They were promptly dispelled, but Zabuza's accomplice had been distracted from Sasuke while they lasted. Hoping to keep the masked boy distracted, he sent in another wave while he attempted to break one of the mirrors with an explosive tag. The mirror yet again refused to break. Hearing some sort of commotion behind him, he turned to look. While he'd been focused on freeing Sasuke, the standoff between Kakashi and Zabuza had finally heated up into a battle. Chapter 11, Wave, Battle on the Bridge 2. "Why?" Sasuke asked as he watched the masked boy decimate wave after wave of that boy's Kage Bunshin. There were several questions that were running through his mind, and they all boiled down to one: why? Why hadn't the boy killed him earlier? Why wasn't this boy making a serious effort to kill him even now? He had him at his mercy, and yet he still held back. Why was he toying with him in this manner? "I was like you once," the masked boy said as he moved from mirror to mirror. "I lost my precious people when my father killed my mother and tried to kill me." At those words, a memory that was always close to the surface yet again came unbidden, a memory of the day he had lost all who were precious to him. He had come home late from training. The Uchiha district had been totally silent. Unnaturally so. He came across the first of the bodies on one of the side streets after he'd turned off the main road to say goodnight to his and whose light was still on his way home. The main path through the district which led to his house had been completely devoid of corpses, as if it had been deliberately swept clear, but, as he continued to explore, he soon discovered that there were more dead littering the alleys and byways of the Uchiha district, a lot more. After finding what had to be at least half the clan lying dead in what seemed to be oceans of blood, he ran fearfully through the silent streets that were littered with the bodies of his kin, dreading what he'd find at home. After what seemed like an eternity, he finally reached the house his family shared. It was dark and completely silent inside and out, as unnaturally silent as the district had been. Fearing what he would find, he ran through the empty halls frantically searching for his parents and his older brother. Inside his parents' bedroom was. The bodies of his parents lay in a heap on the floor, one on top of the other. There was a pool of blood around them, and spatters of blood staining the walls. His parents were dead, and he could sense that he wasn't alone in the room. There was someone hiding in the shadows, possibly the same someone who had murdered his parents. As he stood there uncertain whether to fight or flee, the person moved out of the shadows. It was Itachi. Itachi. The masked boy continued his story, drawing him out of his flashback as he sent another volley of senbon in his direction, forcing him to dodge. My family had been a poor but happy and loving one that had lived on a small farm in water country. The boy said as the senbon sailed through the air. My mother, however, had had a secret that ended up destroying everything when it was discovered. Before I was born, there had been a long and bloody civil war in which those with Kekkai Genkai came to be feared and reviled for having been on the front lines slaughtering thousands upon thousands, shinobi and civilian alike. After the war, having a Kekkai Genkai was basically an automatic death sentence in water country. Despite being a civilian, my mother had been born with a Kekkai Genkai that she had struggled to keep hidden. The boy continued as he settled himself into another mirror and launched another volley of senbon. My mother's Kekkai Genkai had been passed down to me, and one day I discovered my powers and showed them to my mother, not knowing the danger they represented. Unbeknown to either of us, my father had witnessed this. That evening, he and several others from the nearby village came to our home and killed my mother. After they had killed her, my father moved to kill me. I blacked out after that, but when I came to, I learned that I killed my own father. The boy continued as he continued to flash from mirror to mirror, taking out that boy's Kagebunshin at a rate that was becoming just the tiniest bit easier to see. It was then that I discovered that loneliness, the feeling of being unwanted, unneeded by anyone, of not having a purpose, was the worst feeling in the world. The boy said after he'd taken out another batch of that boy's Kagebunshin, as that boy uselessly hammered away at the mirrors from the outside. I was starving on the streets alone for a long time until Zabuza-sama found me. The boy continued as he made an attack that prevented him from exiting the mirrors after he'd thought he'd seen a perfect opening. He had need of me and my powers which everyone else feared. He took me in, and I became his tool, his weapon, an extension of his will, and anything he asks of me, I will do, even if I have to destroy my own heart to do so. The boy finished as he made an attack on that boy who had apparently done something that had rattled one of the mirrors, and that boy went down with several senbon sticking out of him. Hearing that story, he had to admit that he and the masked boy were alike in some ways, and he could see how the boy could feel sympathy for him because he could understand his pain better than most. Both of them had had someone they had loved and trusted to protect them destroy their family. Both of them had been left completely alone in the world afterward. Of course, that didn't make him stop resenting the other boy, who continued to attack him, or stop the other boy from attacking him though. It did, however, make him wonder how his life could have turned out if he hadn't had a need to avenge his clan to drive him. If he had absolutely nothing left after that man had killed his clan, would he have been the same? Would he have completely subsumed his will to that of the first person that had need of him who came along? He was rather quickly pulled out of his musings, because the boy's attacks became even more serious after he finished his story, apparently having reminded himself exactly why he was fighting. Instead of the usual tiny slices, the senbon were starting to stab into his body, but he could see. He could see every move the other boy made. Was this the Sharingan? Had he finally activated it? Kakashi knew he was growing tired, but did his best to not let it show lest Zabuza spotted and exploited this weakness. He had lost a great deal of blood as he made the moves that would put his opponent into check. Fortunately, he wasn't alone in his exhaustion. He could tell that his opponent was becoming exhausted as well, as the unnatural mist had begun to clear because his opponent was unable to continue pumping chakra into it. If his opponent was as exhausted as he appeared, it meant that he would be slower than normal. Good. It was time to finish this. Prepping the field for his finishing move, he pulled out the scroll he used to summon his pack, and put blood on it before resealing it and pressing it into the surface of the bridge. Beneath him, his pack of nindogs made their way to Zabuza, broke through the surface of the bridge, and immobilized the man. After exchanging the usual battle banter, which he could afford to do now that his opponent was immobilized, he powered up a Raikiri. Before he could move forward and impale the swordsman of the mist with it, however, an ice mirror formed right next to him, and several senbon went flying. Due to his exhaustion, which wasn't being helped by the Raikiri, that was eating his chakra like crazy, he wasn't as quick as usual, and he failed to dodge. After being impaled by the senbon, he fell to the ground unable to move. Fortunately, his dogs had dealt with Zabuza's arms, so, unless Zabuza's accomplice, who had so far shown Sasuke and Naruto mercy Sasuke twice, had decided to finish him off, there was a good chance he would live. Behind him he could hear a scream of Kakashi. And he could feel a familiar chakra rising, a chakra he had not felt in over 12 years. Naruto's seal was breaking. Everything went black. Momochi Zabuza growled in frustration at the situation he had found himself in. Hatake Kakashi, the copy nin, was lying on the ground in front of him, and he couldn't do anything to make sure he was finished off thanks to the dogs that were pinning him in place. The one good thing about this situation, however, was that Haku had yet again arrived in the nick of time to save his hide. That boy was more than worth all of the time and effort he had spent on him. Kakashi was down, possibly permanently, but there was a more immediate threat to deal with. There was a new player on the battlefield, a powerful new player. The malevolent chakra he had sensed shortly after the copy ninja had fallen to Haku's senbon continued to rise with each passing second. Who or whatever it was could be a serious danger to him. Suddenly, there was a yell to his left, and the blonde Inuzuka boy was racing up to him. As the boy approached, the dogs that had been holding him immobile scattered in all directions with their tails between their legs. He himself barely had time to register the fact that the boy had transformed when he came barreling into him on all fours. As his mind desperately scrabbled to find out what the hell was going on, the clawed and fanged boy with the slit-pupiled red eyes sent him flying and attacked him again. Haku tried to defend him, and got attacked himself for his troubles. After the boy incapacitated Haku, he focused on him once more, barreling into him, and trying to slice him open with his claws. All he could think the entire time this was happening was, holy shit. This had most definitely not been how he'd planned for this attack to go. For the second time in Uzumaki Naruto's life, he was seeing red. That boy Haku had taken out Kakashi, and it was all that Zabuza guy's fault. He'd heard that Haku boy's story, and knew that if that Zabuza guy hadn't made Haku fight, then he wouldn't have, and Kakashi would have been fine. He was going to kill him. He was going to kill the both of them. He attacked Zabuza first because he was the one responsible, the one who had been actively trying to kill Kakashi, while Haku had been trying to spare him and Sasuke. As he was dealing with the man, Haku tried to attack him. The key word there being tried. He swiftly dealt with Haku and turned back to Zabuza, intent on tearing him apart. As he was about to land the final blow on that Zabuza guy, he smelled danger. Had the Haku boy gotten up? He whirled around in the direction the scent had originated. It wasn't the Haku boy. There was someone else here. No, several someones. He smelled sweat, unwashed bodies, and steel. Lots and lots of steel. There was an army somewhere nearby. How pathetic. Someone he couldn't yet see said. I had hoped you would be able to take the other ninja with you before I took you out, but clearly the demon of the mist isn't all he's cracked up to be. Demon? Demon? Pa? More like a minor imp at best. You got brought down by a little kid. He didn't like that voice. There was something wrong about it. Something that reminded him of every unpleasant person he'd run into in his entire life. I should have sent my mercenaries in the first place, since you obviously couldn't get the job done. The person said as the mist that had been obscuring his vision faded. The mist cleared completely, revealing a short, stocky, grayish-brown-haired man in a suit and sunglasses with a cane standing at the head of a small army. He could have sworn he'd seen the man before somewhere, but he couldn't place him. The men standing behind the man were armed to the teeth with a wide variety of weapons which ranged from swords to pikes. Kill the survivors, then move on to the village. The people there need to be taught a lesson. The man at the head of the group, whom he finally realized was the businessman Gato whose picture he'd seen in the paper, said. "Kill the survivors?" But Sasuke and Sakura and Tazuna were the survivors, and he had sworn to protect them, and he never went back on his word. There was no way in hell he would let that happen. There was no way he would let the man who had ordered Zabuza to kill Kakashi take out the rest of his team. The red haze that had been gradually fading overtook him once more, growing deeper until there was nothing left but red. Sasuke couldn't quite process what he was seeing. It had started when the masked boy had left the mirrors entirely in the middle of a battle that had been entirely in his favor for some reason, and less than a minute later the mirrors all shattered, freeing him. Despite the fact that he had been freed, he could do nothing more than sit and watch what happened next, because the masked boy's Senbon seriously restricted his mobility and prevented him from doing much else. The first thing he saw after the mirrors shattered was the masked boy lying on the ground. The second was Kakashi, obviously having been taken out by the swordsman Zabuza. The third was that boy tearing the swordsman apart. Then, someone else arrived, someone who had been at the head of an armed mob. It was what happened next after the mercenaries had shown up that he had been unable to process. After the man at the head of the mob had ordered the mob to kill them, that boy changed as he raced towards the men on all fours. As the boy sped towards the group, a strange red energy started bubbling up from that boy, and surrounded him, a strange red energy that caused an ominous feeling to wash over him even where he sat so far away from the coming action. The first thing that boy did when he reached the group was grab the ankle of the fleeing leader, pull him towards him, and tear his throat out. As soon as the leader was dead, he then started on the mob. One man impaled that boy with a spear, and he pulled it out and continued attacking as if nothing had even happened. The wound that the spear had made closed before his very eyes. After the grievous wound that had been caused by the spear had healed, that boy then started cutting a swathe through the group of mercenaries. The men soon began to break ranks and flee when they realized that their weapons were ineffective. That boy would just keep pulling them out, and continue fighting while his wounds healed right before their very eyes. Heedless of the damage he caused as well as the damage that was caused to him, that boy chased the men as they fled over the side of the bridge. What was that boy? He couldn't possibly be human. Naruto. Someone behind him called, gaining his and everyone else's attention. As he watched, that boy turned away from the slaughter and raced over towards the source of the voice, which turned out to belong to Tazuna's small grandson who was at the head of a mob of locals armed with tools and farming equipment. As that boy moved past him, he could see that he had somehow grown claws and fangs, and that the strange marks on his face had grown larger and more feral looking. There was something else as well, that boy's eyes weren't blue, they were red. Naruto. The Tazuna's grandson cried out when that boy was almost on top of him. That boy reached up to attack, but stopped before he landed the final blow. The ominous red energy that boy emitted began to dissipate. The claws shrank back into nails, and the marks turned back into lines. The fangs presumably vanished as well. "Hey Inari," that boy said. "Sorry about that. Just what in the hell was Uzumaki Naruto?" As Naruto spoke with Inari and the mob of villagers who had come with him, Haku had slowly made his way to his fallen master's side. Finally, after what seemed like forever, he reached him. He was weak, in pain, and quite possibly bleeding internally as well as externally, but that didn't matter. Only Zabuza-sama mattered. Zabuza-sama was alive. Barely. He had lost far more blood than was healthy, and would continue to lose even more if he didn't do something. Using one of the few healing jutsu he knew, he pushed his chakra into Zabuza-sama until he was about to pass out. There was a good chance that he wouldn't wake up because he had used up so much of his chakra. There was also a chance that Zabuza-sama would die despite his ministrations as well. He would cross that bridge later when he came to it though. His last thought as his consciousness faded was, if Zabuza-sama dies, then I don't want to wake up. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.